Ghosts of Mosman Park. This recording is based on an oral history project that was commissioned by the Grove Community History Library in 2017, capturing stories of the industrial sites that were once a feature of Mosman Park and had all ceased to exist by the end of the century. The Colonial Sugar Refinery, General Motors Holden Assembly Plant, CSBP Farmers Fertiliser Works and the State Engineering Works were just some of the big employers in the area and all an important feature in Perth's industrial history. The recording begins with descriptions of Mosman Park in the mid-20th century, followed by some stories around each of these sites. It concludes with reflections on how Mosman Park's changed since their closure and what this means to some of those people who worked in them. Contributors include Trevor Thomas, Jeff Atherton, Merv Legg, Dennis Graham, Glenn Fruin, Bill Davis, Peter Winter, John Hughes, Paul Martin, Kevin Locke, Eileen Lawford and Rob Lowndes. Interviewing and editing was by Kate Patterson.
And that was a working man's area too there, by the way, and you could have bought a house, this is in the 60s, so cheap, anywhere in Mosman Park. It was looked on as being really working man's area. How things change. Wow. Knowing what I know now, of course. There was the sugar works, there was the state engineering works, the old Rose Hotel now, which is not a pub, but that was a hotel, and that was a very, very busy hotel for all the working men of the day. And a lot of men lived in Mosman Park and that who worked on the wharves, you see, and the stevedores. And, they had huge big work crews down there. So, it was very, very busy. But I can remember living at Thompson Road because the wharves in those days were so busy. New Year's Eve, all the ships at midnight would all blow their hooters on the ships, and you could hear that just about certainly all over Fremantle. And if it was a still night, you'd hear them quite a bit inland. It was a magnificent sound to hear at midnight, New Year's Eve. That's all gone now. You don't get many ships in there, and it's all changed.
Oh, it was a big community then. Most of the people that I mixed with were either school friends or, working with the motors and everything. The football team, the cricket team was all part of it, and it kept the people together. And there was quite a lot of rivalry between Cottesloe and Mosman Park. Even in school days, we wouldn't go to Mosman Park School.
Well, it was a working hub, but I didn't really look at it that way because I don't think there was any special transport that would take people to and from. Well, though a lot of those people would have probably lived in, I know Eric Chart's brother-in-law, he was a manager of the Holden line in there, so, and he lived in the Mosman Park area. You can see the difference of, since they've knocked down, they got rid of the limestone and built the homes, it's a thriving little area. As I said, from even on the state engineering works, that all was limestone. And right through, as far as we could see, from out of the workshops, it was all limestone and nobody would build on it. Nobody wanted to. Because there was a better land before. Now they just scraped the top of the limestone off, put a bit of sand on it, and soil, and built their homes. Good foundation.
Beagle Street, they used to call it 11 Beagle Street, but actually when the numbers were allotted, the 11 was the lot number, not the street number. It was 21 Beagle. There used to be an explosive depot at the bottom of the hill there. The Harley Scramble used to go behind the hill. There was a small cottage, it was only small, which Dad added to himself. But why they went there, Dad could work to Mount Lyell for his works. I used to go and pay off a loan that they'd taken out, so they might have borrowed the money.
Businesses around there, you had the sugar works, the super place, and then you had all the foundries in North Fremantle, so it wasn't far from any of them. And of course, just up on the hill, where are we? If that's the front, just up on the hill there, you had the army battery, which I spent a fair bit of time on push bikes up through there. And there was no housing or anything over there in those days. All that was vacant. The top end of Mosman Park in those days was war service settlement. So I think there might have been a lot of those people.
Bush, all bush, and the street ended at our house. Came from Alston Street down, and it wasn't until, I don't know how old I was, that they finished the road. But Mum had to drag us through in a stroller, through the sand, up to the bus stop. I can remember standing under a horse in our front yard, and there were sheep, but Billy Goat Farm was opposite us. They called it Billy Goat Farm, but it wasn't being used as a farm. But there were still sheep and horses around. You know, people used to keep horses in their backyard, even in Cathy Grove here, for years. And Mum used to get the children to walk over to where, you heard of the Yellery? Like a sand track going down to the river, where the lookout is now. And she'd take the kids up there and they'd collect runners from the bush, you know, buffalo grass, and plant them in the garden to get lawn going. Girls that I went to school with called me a snob, or that we were rich. And I went, we're not rich. What makes you think we're rich? Well, you've got your own home. Because they lived in war service or returned servicemen's homes, whatever they were called. I didn't know the difference. Kids don't. Well, see, it was a very working class area then. Very working class. Now it's not. All the nouveau riche have moved in, and I still call houses where my friends live. If I'm talking to my friend Bev, I'll say, you know, I'm near Henry's. Oh, yeah, I know who you mean. Because we know who lived in each house. Even though they don't live there now, or the house is gone, we can name. Now you don't know anyone. Neighbours don't speak to no one. I think a lot of people that live in Mosman Park wouldn't even know that there was an industrial site here years ago. They wouldn't have a clue. Well, it was two different suburbs, really, because you had Hobnobs, you know, up on Hobnobs Hill. But you didn't know them. And they're the ones with the money. And then you came down, and then you had all the working return servicemen, all the blue-collar workers. And so it was sort of two separate areas. And we all stuck together because we had the ocean, the river, and Peppermint Grove. Well, we didn't mix with Peppermint Grove. They didn't mix with us. So we were isolated. So we all stuck together.
There was a lot of people that were war service people, and because when we started there, they were the older ones and we were the new youngies. Yeah. Now we're the old ones in our street. We've been the longest from our section of the street, from Wellington Street to McCabe Street. We're the longest people have been living there the longest of anyone. I suppose probably, yeah, because it was more a workers' area, Mosman Park, to start with, and except the bits on the river where all the houses are hanging off the cliffs and all that sort of thing. But it was a big like a workers' area, and but now it's sort of upgrading. well, no one was very happy when they built the flats, and got a lot of undesirables, and there was a street there called Battle Street, and aptly named. Yeah, there's a lot of flats there, and I think they've tried to upgrade things a bit now, but there's still a couple of parts there that are not too good. And, so, but luckily we were far enough away from that. So,
but most of them seem to be local. Well, you know, the factory was, well, you know where it was. But yeah, people just walked or rode their bikes home. Yeah, there weren't people coming from... Socially, it was very much more working class than an upper end. I mean, it's 180 degrees from where it is now. Because they were all people who had told you a million times, I don't exaggerate. But the people, for example, in Hope Street, where we also lived, had large blocks where they grew their fruit, their vegetables, they had goats to milk, they had chickens. I mean, there was a lot of that going on. It was just a pleasant place to be. Yeah. And there were football levels and hockey, I think, or hockey. And I'd never seen a hockey pitch in England, other than at school for girls, but not men. Nobody stood on ceremony. I mean, Jack was as good as his master. There was very much that. I mean, you know, people say, you know, the sky's the limit and so on. Well, it really did seem to be, which is one of the reasons I settled here, because, you know, you didn't get judged by what you've been previously or whatever.
Oh, it was just a fabulous place to live. I was so lucky to live in North Fremantle. Dad was a truck driver. We were not a wealthy family. We didn't have any money. I'm sure they didn't have any money. I can speak for them. But we got by. I lived on the beach, and when I wasn't on the beach, the sea breeze coming in, I lived on the river. Now I'm paying for it with all the cancers being cut out of me. It was just a wonderful existence there. All the industry, State Engineering Works, and then the Sulphur Works, which was up further, and then the sugar refinery here, which was also a sewage dump. You aware of that? There's a sewage dump here somewhere. That's a golf course now, 64. I'm going back into the early 50s. So we'd swim in Rocky Bay in the afternoon, and we'd swim in the mornings until the sea breeze came in over at Leighton Beach. And straight over the river after a sandwich, come back at dinner time. Fantastic. Now, the State Engineering Works had some fencing. These are old photos which show you nothing really, Mum and me when I was a little boy. But in the background you can see the buildings of the engineering works. Yes, it was a wonderful experience really, because we had anywhere to play. As I said, the beach and then the river. And then in the engineering works there were no restrictions. Nobody came to kick us out. We climbed over all the machinery, all the stacked old railway wooden carriages or box. As you know, the State Engineering Works used to manufacture farm equipment before the war, but then they, I think, started making Bren gun carriers and troop carriers and things of that nature. Down the road from us was the horse stables, where they had draft horses and carts. The horse stables, yes, they were wonderful. They had 2 or 3 horses, draft horses, these big, huge big horses. Stables were opposite the Haywoods boarding house.
But when I left there, if we can move on to the sugar works perhaps, when I was retrenched, I thought to myself, that's never ever going to happen to me again. It's the most terrible. I thought to myself, that's never going to happen again. I'm going to join the government. So I applied to join the police force, and I was accepted. In 65 I applied, early 65. And I was accepted, but I was told that it would be some months before I was inducted into a police academy. And I'd never done shift work. I knew I'd be required to do shift work as a policeman, so I managed to get a job at the sugar works, and they worked around the clock. So I worked there for 6 months. Well, the sugar works was a different area altogether. It was just wonderful there. They had such a happy fraternity of men, very, very strong union. They had good conditions, and I thoroughly enjoyed my 6 months that I worked there at the sugar works. But I worked at the Char End there, and as you get older and you reflect back on a lot of those places, some of them weren't very cognisant of health safety factors. I mean, we worked amongst a lot of asbestos lagging, as they called it, wrapped around all pipes and that to keep water or steam outlets hot. And so anyone who worked at places like that, yeah, you have a little bit of a sword of Damocles hanging over you for the rest of your life because of the mesothelioma, of course. Marvellous. Everyone was very, very happy working there. I think because it was quite good pay and the conditions were marvellous. We were provided with all the clothing, the overalls, completely cover overalls with CSR boldly proclaimed on them. And it was just very, very good. There's just a couple of things I remember, of course, is that the Char End I worked in is where the sugar in its liquid form, like a treacle, was actually drained through huge big tanks that held 35 tonnes of char, raw char, and that'd only be good for straining the syrup through for 48 hours or whatever. Then they had to be emptied, where you had a big trapdoor at the bottom. You'd open that and most of the char would pour out. Because it was sticky and tacky, there'd be about 5 tonne left inside, and steam everywhere. You'd had no choice. You had to get in and dig it out, and that was very, very hard. Yeah, a big shovel and then a rake, and you'd have to rake it all out, and it was heavy work because the char would be so cloggy, all clogged together and treacly, and it was tough work. One sad incident I remember at the sugar works was a delightful old chap who was a cat lover. And whenever he came on shift, he'd always bring food with him and feed the stray cats around the factory. I can't remember his name, but he's just a very, very endearing, gentle, lovely man. And one day, for some reason, he had urgently leave the area he was working in, and he accidentally trod with his boot on one of the little kittens and killed it. And being an animal lover myself, I was aghast, but he was just terrible, in a terrible state, this dear old chap. He actually broke down and cried. I've never forgotten that, those things that stay in your memory. He was such a lovely old man. It couldn't have happened, to worse. It's terrible, but I remember that well. The other thing I have to mention about the sugar works is the machinery was all made in Scotland, as most machinery was for those big factories. The same as the electrical place down at South Fremantle that used to have at Rob's Jetty there. The machinery all came from Scotland originally, and I've got to pay tribute to all the men that worked in those areas where these huge plant equipment. It was kept immaculate. You could go in, you could virtually eat off those factory floors. It's an absolute credit to those men that worked there, how they kept that machinery. You could rub your finger anywhere on the machinery at all, and you'd never have any residual oil slick or anything left on your fingers. They were just all highly polished.
71. 1 week off 23. Only fans, no air conditioning. Yeah, no adding machines. Everything was done manually. I started off as the delivery clerk and switchboard. Then I had to learn payroll manually. And then when the computers came, I was data entry plus the switchboard. Then we had a systems administrator, which was one of the accountants. So I trained 3 of these accountants to be systems administrator. And then when the 4th one came, I said, no, I'm not training him. What? I said, well, I've trained 3. Why? If I can train them, why aren't I the systems administrator? Oh, a woman thing. So off he went upstairs, John Cameron, and he said, look, yes, don't know why we've never thought of it before. Yeah, you can be systems administrator. I said, oh, okay. I said, and I want 2 job grade increases. Then after that, when anyone left, I got that job. 76. It always relates back to CSR. They had things called blue notes, which the staff members could get deals like a blue requisition. You can go and get paint and building materials, but it cost price with these blue requisitions. And anyway, there's one that I read. They used to have your initials on them. And I found one that didn't have my initials on it. And I thought, I must have missed that one. And in it was that females now were allowed to get home loans. 1978. You weren't allowed to get home loans. Even if you walked in off the street, you couldn't get one. But CSR backed you. They said, yes, your job's going to be permanent. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know whether you've heard about Russell Leaf. He was the Perth manager. So, I think I was the first woman to apply. And of course, 78, 79, 80, bang, up went the interest rates, up to 18%. I didn't have to pay them. The deal was that if you got this loan, I think it was something like 3% or 5%. They paid the difference. We had a watchman there called Racconi. I think we had two night watchmen, and they'd come in, and because there was night shift people working, and he lived in his car in the car park until we got a new manager, and he saw him hanging his washing out on the trees. We didn't worry about it, but he said, can't have that, woo, woo. And when they returned sugar, sometimes they'd throw bread and a couple of cans in it, just junk. And he'd get there and take it all out, and that's what he lived on. And he went to Singapore every year on the Centaur. Every year. Anyway, this particular night... Anyway, I was in the flat at that time, and so it was prior to 76. It might have been 75. And I heard on the news that there was a murder at an industrial site in Mosman Park, and I went. And when I got in there, police everywhere, and it was someone that worked there. He was on medication, and he stopped taking it. And he came in, and no one will know what the story was he said to Fred Racconi, because no one else was there. but he got in and he was after someone. But just after that, Fred did his rounds and came upon him. And this guy beat Fred to death with a shovel. So, management. I never had a problem. To me, they were all the same. I know we got different, we were probably treated differently and got more, we had more advantages, but we didn't flaunt them. But it was a mentality of, from the workers, them and us. But it didn't really go around the other way. There was a couple of them that used to call the workers rock apes and I said to them, look, I don't like that term phrase. It's just, I said, and if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here. The packing station, which was upstairs, and the 30 kg bags down the bottom, they sort of had a dangerous job because, the bags were coming through and they had to lift them. Things were coming down in chutes to pack them on bales, so anything could have gone wrong. One girl up in the packing station, while I was there, she had she was Italian, I think. She had long hair and I don't think she had a cap on, hairnet, and the hair was just ripped off her scalp. When David Bills was the refinery manager, he vocalised that he was going to stop the steam whistle from sounding at 5 o'clock. Val's another one that lived in Mosman's, we both said, oh, you can't do that. He said, why? I said, because you'll have people ringing up. They set their clock to it. Kids have to come home with that. He goes, what? So he stopped it. The switchboard lit up. Had to put it back on again. Because you'd hear the sugary, like everyone called it the sugary. Mum would say, be home by the sugary whistle. We'd say, oh, what about the super? No, sugary. The sugar whistle would go, but then the superworks would go after it. So you had that time in between to run home. Ours was a boop, and theirs was like an air raid siren. I think it was an air raid siren, actually, superworks. And because there wasn't a lot of buildings and houses around, you could hear. There wasn't a lot of noise. And my mum could stand on the front step and call out, David! And you'd hear his voice coming from 4 streets away. Come in. They had a lot of bushland, which originally wasn't fenced in. It just sort of merged into where the golf course is. That was a reserve. And the bushlanders went up. And then they bulldozed the reserve, made a golf course. And there was spider orchids and kangaroo paws and leschenoltia, everything. All gone. Banksia trees. And I think that's when CSR fenced off their bit because they were building a road down around the river, more houses. And so quite a bit of it was bushland, like surrounding around the refinery. And it was quiet. Very quiet, and lots of birds. The people on the other side of the river, I think, quite liked it. I know my dentist who's just retired, Max Trott. He's got a beautiful photograph that someone took with lightning in the sky because it was Gothic sort of building. And the people over the river, when it was working at night, all the lights were on. It looked like a castle. So And half the people in Mosman Park didn't even know it was there. Wouldn't have a clue it was there. See, all the trees had grown up, and if I said, you know, I work at CSR, they say, well, where's that? They think it was the CSIRO. No, CSR Sugar on the river. Where?
Before it closed down, they got rid of a third of the staff. So instead of 60 odd people, they went down to 40 sort of thing, and then they changed things around. That was a washout. That was because they expected people to do double the amount of stuff, and it just didn't work. It was a new system that they tried. That there was this South African bloke came over, and he's one of these efficiency expert things, I suppose, and that was the idea. To get rid of a lot of the workforce, and then get contractors to do a lot of stuff, and everyone else to do double the amount of what they're supposed to do. And initially they used to come and because we didn't have the phone on to start with, and but they used to come up, and the shift super would come down and knock on the window and wake me up. But as soon as I got the phone on, then they used to just ring me up. But yeah, there was quite a bit of a hierarchy, but it got better as it went on, as the years went on and everything. They changed, their attitudes changed, and some of the older fellas that were there, because they retired and so forth, and then younger people came on and they had better ideas, and they used to listen a bit more, and they discussed things a bit more too.
Yes, it was, and the whole factory had sort of family atmosphere, I guess. There are lots of father-son combinations and brothers and things, as you'll have seen in some of those photographs, and the names of people. Relations with the staff was very strong, or with the workforce was very strong. In fact, it was a time when Gordon Jackson had become general manager of CSR, and he'd written a paper for the federal government. Doc Whitlam came to power, called the Green Paper on Manufacturing, and that was a pretty major sort of national paper. Bob Hawke was on his one of the people on the committee who put it together, and Gordon Jackson, the CSR general manager, was the chairman of that committee. So it's called the Jackson Report for short, or Green Paper on Manufacturing. And his big thing in that was about employee relations, and that was largely because I think the influence of people like Hawke and a very strong behavioural science community at University of New South Wales, who were also involved in that paper. So it's big on employee relations. So I went over there as a fresh MBA graduate who'd gone to the same university where these experts had come from, with a big emphasis on employee relations. So it was like a breath of fresh air in a way for the place, because the previous management had been more the old style of not telling people what was going on and just expecting them to do their work. And we got over there and we had consultative committees and things, and just generally involving the workers in the business. And I think that went very well. And people were a bit surprised that there was something involved. And because Cottesloe, although it was the smallest sugar refinery in Australia by quite a long way, it was, I think, about fifth or even smaller than that, the size of the big refineries in Sydney and in Yarraville in Melbourne. Its costs were amongst the lowest. Its maintenance costs were lower than any of the others, and also its general cost of refining was pretty low. And it was protected in a way too, because, as you know, in Perth it's expensive to ship up stuff over from the eastern states, whereas to go from the west to the east is generally cheaper. And so it had sort of a cost advantage. I suspect the main reason for selling it off was probably not on cost or efficiency. I suspect it was more just the value of the land. And when CSR it has had and continues to have ups and downs. I mean, I've seen it go from number 3 public company in Australia when I joined it to now barely making the top 150. I don't think it makes it top 150 now. It's now just a really building materials company. But in rough times, it would tend to look at its assets and sell things and then lease them back or do whatever just to get cash. And I think you'd argue economically, for example, that site was probably going to get a better return if you just hung on to it because of appreciation in value than by selling it. But when they want the cash, that's when I think it would have been sold, when times were tough. The big part of sugar refining is once the sugar syrup has been removed of the impurities, and so you've got a product that's actually pure sucrose, pure sugar, you then have to boil it up to recrystallise it to form the sugar crystals. And that uses that's the biggest steam user in the factory. And all that water that's boiled off has to be condensed. And to do that, that's where we use the salt water. So the refineries are always located where there's salt water you can pump from the river or the harbour up through condensers to condense that steam. So they tend to be in great locations.
They left school at 14, a lot of them, because that was the legal age.
Yeah.
And for employment, they went to places like the sugar works. But what happened with the sugar bags, during the war, the sugar bag was really something. They used to get, your mother did it for you. You know, a bag came out and you got this corner and you tucked it into that corner and it became a cape. And your mum put a tape around it and that's what you ran and got your cape, and then you went to the air raid shelter.
I eventually got employment at General Motors. I suppose I would have been nearly 19, and I got a job on the assembly line. It was very demanding work, but I was lucky because I was young, I was very, very fit, very strong, and I was lucky I always had very, very dexterous hands. So the work I did on the assembly line I found easily manageable. That assembly line at General Motors never stopped unless it was sabotaged, which happened frequently in those days. It would go all the time, tick, 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 tick. And it was our Lord and our Master. And every section of the line that encompassed a man doing a set allocation of tasking on the cars as they came through, that took up 7 minutes. Now that was accorded a decimal gradation, and it was all done by time and motion study. So the work I performed was given a gradation of 6.72, which was extremely high because time and motion studies really were ruthlessly, they were tough on their measurement. And you got to remember, 7 minutes, the car had moved from entering my position on the line and leaving it. But I was lucky, I was young, I was quick, and I could race through my job and get it done in about 5 minutes. And the reason I used to do that is there were some older men further up the line, in particular around the time of all immigration from countries like Latvia, Italy, etc., Greece. Massive migration over here, and one old guy called Wally, and he was a Latvian, and he must have been in his mid-50s, and he had a terrible time trying to do his job within that 7 minutes. So, being the type of person I was, I used to race through my job, then race up the line and help him and get him through. And I can remember I had a union man on one occasion come and tap me on the shoulder. He said, "Trevor," he says, "we want to tell you to slow down." I was stunned. I said, "Why?" I said, "That's just me. I love work." And he said, "No," he said, "you've been told, slow down," he said. And he didn't elaborate on that, but it was enough. Anyway, I ignored that, and I kept on doing my function the way I wanted to, so I'd go and help these other old guys. They had a whole area set aside for those who came to work on motorbikes. And they had some amazing machinery there, some of these older guys. There was a couple of guys that had original Harleys with side cars, great big things with about a 1250 motor in them. And to kick them over, there'd be this great bang, and then you'd hear the piston go boom, boom, boom as it would chug along and warm up. This is only a week ago I ran into him, and I told him about this interview we're having today, and we got talking. And he said, you know, he said, about that time there was a bloke killed there. And I said, well, no, I didn't. I said, it must have been when I went back to New Zealand for that period, between time of the two periods I was employed there. He said, yes, it was a bloke called apparently a Mr. Birtwhistle. And his job was to start the cars up when they come off the end of the assembly line. And sometimes, because everything was all new, they'd have a bit of trouble. So apparently he had the hood up of a brand new car at the end of the assembly line, fine tweaking it and retuning it to get it started so it could be driven off to wherever it went. And apparently a car behind, just coming off the assembly line, got jammed somehow. And the assembly line that didn't stop, still going, and of course it built up this pressure on the car, and when it finally got released through the pressure of the assembly line, pushing, it just catapulted forward into the back of this other car, and that went forward, and apparently this Mr. Birtwhistle had his head down like that, and the hood came down, and he toppled off and fell into a pit and was killed. Yes, we had one chap on the line, Romano Nanny, and he ended up, he left General Motors and started up Nanny's supermarket in Beaconsfield, and he's now retired. But he was very, very Italian in those days. He hadn't been over here very long. He had a remarkable tenor voice. In fact, he had, by invitation, sung in a couple of nightclubs, and they wanted to keep him doing that, but he didn't. But while he was working on the line, he'd break out into some of those glorious old Italian songs, and O Sole Mio and ones like that. He was very, very good. He had a beautiful, clear Italian tenor voice, and that was a treat to hear him singing at the top of his voice in this fine, beautiful tenor voice.
My brother-in-law worked there, and they were putting on people, and he said to me, why don't you come down? And so I did, and I started straight away. Either 1958, 59, 60, in that era anyway.
Yeah.
They wanted me to be the union rep, but I declined the offer.
He died when my father was about 12, and then my grandmother remarried, and she remarried Vic Blake. He was a war veteran from the First World War, and I don't even know when they became caretakers at General Motors, but they were there a long time. And I know they were there during the Second World War, because they used to, he used to tell me they used to build pontoons and all that sort of stuff for the army during the Second World War.
In the car factory?
In the factory, yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And I know because bits and pieces of it ended up at our place afterwards, the timbers and that. Because they owned a house at 4 Monument Street. They had a house there, and my parents lived around the country for a while. Then they came back, and we lived in that house while our grandparents lived at the plant. We used to go there probably once every couple of weeks for dinner, usually for a weekend or something. A weekend, and I used to do the rounds of the plant with my grandfather, or step-grandfather as he was, because he was the night watchman come caretaker of the place, and we used to walk around and check all the doors, and in the course of being that age and seeing all the cars half built and all that was quite an exciting thing. And of course they used to do a bit of cleaning as well. Grandmother used to clean all the offices and that. And I honestly don't know how long they were there, but I reckon it must have been 20 years or so.
I got a job on the wheat bins at CBH. So started there and met a chap there, and when the bins had finished, his father was a foreman at GMH. And it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I got a job as a labourer in GMH. Dogman, that's what I was, a dogman. And you picked up crates and then dropped the American engines that were imported, and the V8s, and was responsible for, well, with others, dropping the engines in. I mean, I'm not a mechanic and never will be, but all you had to do was tie the ropes on or the hooks and drop the engines into the engine bay. You've read Clive James's book Unreliable Memoirs? Yeah, well, that's what I've got now. So all I remember doing there is moving things with the crane, the overhead crane, and then just hooking it on or whatever. So that's all I remember doing. But yeah, so having worked in British factories, it was quite usual for people when it was knock-off time, let's say 5 o'clock, people would start knocking off at 4 o'clock, washing and grooming themselves, having a chat, all this sort of stuff, and then they'd line up at the clock to clock off. Here, they didn't. They hid behind the machinery and the boxes and the crates and the cars, and they were ready to go at 5 o'clock or whatever the time was, but they would hide. But as soon as the hooter went, they'd all rush out. I thought, well, this is a coward's way of doing it. So what I used to do was go and wait at the clock. And they thought, well, you'll be in for it. I said, well, you've knocked off. I'm just here and first in the queue. Anyway, I got a warning, and the second time it happened, I was gone.
Dad says, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a motor mechanic. And they said, oh, come in and we do a test. I did a test at the railways, and then I had to do a test at the state engineering works to show what I could do and what I couldn't do. Then I got the call up saying that I'd been had a job as a wagon and coach builder at the WAGR up in Midland. And I had a mate that worked up there, so I thought, oh, that's good. Anyhow, 2 weeks after, I got a job, a notice saying that I got a job as apprenticeship as a fitter and turner over at the State Engineering Works. And Dad says, well, that's better than going up to Midland. You can ride your bike over to North Fremantle. And I said, oh, right, so that's how I got the job over there. And that was in 56, I think. Yeah, 56. Yeah, the work started. When we did the iron work was because we had all the foundry work. The state engineering had a big foundry, and they did all the pipe work for the waterworks and Muja power station. They did all the big pipe work for that, cast iron pipes and stuff. Yeah, so that's when I started there. And yeah, I was taken back because I'd never been in a big engineering place like that, and the foreman, Bill Bruce, came up to me and introduced himself because there was three apprentices, but there was only two of us. And he laid down the rules, what he wanted. You had to do this, this, this and this, and if I copped you doing this, this and this and this, you get a kick in the backside. So,
what was his name?
Bill Bruce. He was the machine shop foreman, and Mr. Proper John was the fitting shop foreman, because they both worked in the same area. And I think Mr. Hall was the general manager of the Estate Engineering Works then. I only knew him as Mr. Hall. Machine shop would have had probably 30. The fitting shop would have had 20. The boil shop would have had 20 blokes. And there was the meter work repair shop. That's the water meters, the WDK water meters. We used to repair all the water meters for them. And also the blacksmiths, they would have been 15 blacksmiths probably. A pattern shop, there would have been probably 5, 10 pattern makers. Foundry, there would have been probably 15, 20 people working there, more. And the State Engineering Works was that was called the Implement Works, State Implement Works first. And then during the war, the Americans brought a lot of machinery over to do work on the subs, because they had a sub base in Fremantle, and they brought a big lathe. There was a 100-foot bed lathe and a couple of other big machines to be able to do work for the Americans during the war. Because we did all the repairs for the state ships, and we did all the dredging work that was done in the Fremantle Harbour at that time. That work was done through the State Engineering Works, and there was a lot of other. We did all state ship work. We didn't do it all because we weren't allowed to make profit. We were allowed to have probably 7% profit margin on our work, and the other people would get the job. And because we had the big machines and the knowledge, they used to subcontract out, and then they would fit it up, and we'd machine it up for them, and they'd do it that way. And it was like, if we weren't allowed to take a newspaper in and read a newspaper, or we weren't allowed to do anything like that. When we were on the job, when the whistle blew, we had to be at the machine and working, and before we knocked off, we had to clean the machine down and make sure everything was ready for the next day to start up again. So it was pretty strict working conditions, but it was good because we learnt a lot. And the old tradesmen that had worked there, they were willing. If you were willing enough to be able to go and have a chat to them and ask them questions, sensible questions, they would sit and tell you what they did and how they did it. Because we used to have to make all our own machinery tools and stuff like that. They never had the tungsten tips and the chip tips like they've got nowadays, and the NC machines. So yeah. We also took on, during the 50s, then we had a lot of immigration coming through, and we took on a lot of immigration people from England that came over, because their working machinery type of thing, they would started to slow down because they were sending a lot over to Japan and stuff, different countries and they were migrating out here and working machines and the boiler making, and we'd get a 20-gallon drum, punch holes in it and put wood in it, and because there was no heating in the workshop and it was all open to the river, because the riverfront ran right around. Right. We were right on the riverfront, and we'd light up, and because there's plenty of wood, because they used to use the wood to heat up the cast iron pipes so they can dip them in the tar to make them last longer. So we used to get the wood and chop it up and put a bit of coke and coal in it and have the fires in there. Other things that I can remember is one time I was doing a little job for myself, which wasn't allowed, but you'd have to try and do it in between, and the foreman got it and took it off me and kept it in the office. Never to be seen again. After it was in the office for a couple of weeks, he didn't know where it went, but it was back on the car at that time. It was an aluminium rocket cover, and I machined it up for myself and put it on, and he took it off me and he says, "You're not getting it," because I asked him a couple of times for it. He says, "No, you're not getting that." But it seemed to have got out of the office somehow and got into the car. So.
His car?
My car.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was one little thing. A lot of other, what was the other things? It was always good humour there. At a Christmas time, we'd have a Christmas party and we'd set up the boiler shop, and they would have a big stage and they'd have somebody in to play music, and they'd be singing and dancing and that type of stuff. It was other good memories. It was the relationship between the foreman. He knew he was the boss. You knew you didn't answer him back or anything. The leading hands and that, they were all mates because they came up through the ranks. Most of them were apprentices there and gone up through the ranks. But we never had any trouble with any of them. Because of the area where it was, I don't know why they would have, I think it was because the land didn't seem to be worth anything. It was on top of rock. It was a cliff for all the way around where the state engineering works. That was a limestone cliff. And it was worth nothing because it was all limestone. So I suppose that's why it was a government land, and they said, "Oh, we'll put it there." Because also the train used to run through the front of the state engineering works and then up to CSBP, to the fertilising place, and that train used to go back through there, so they had a train line supplying that type of thing. I suppose the CSBP, the fertiliser mob would be making stuff for the war efforts and stuff like that. So. And then back out again. And if we made anything really big, we could put it on a bogie and take it out as well. Yeah.
Like you think of the Midland workshop, it was ginormous, and it produced all the mostly rolling locomotives and stuff, but they could build anything. But SCW was like that. They could build almost anything, and did. During the war they built tanks, and we built, I think we built a pilot boat from Fremantle Port at one time, and all sorts of things were built there, along with other simple little things. But one thing I always remember was the Ord River project was on at that time. It was a big project. And we had to make a lot of the equipment that was sent up for the Ord River, all sorts of dam equipment and pumps and God knows what. And that's where the state shipping service came in, because state ships had cargo ships which were running all the way up to the coast. So the stuff was made in the state engineering works, and then it was sort of railed to the port and put on board the state ships, and then they'd plonk their way up to Wyndham, for the Ord River, and everything was unloaded that way. Well, it was lovely because being right on the riverbank there, we got the lovely sea breeze, because it was very hot in the summertime. You can imagine it was cooking. But as soon as the sea breeze came in, it flowed right up the river. It came up through all the works, and everything cleared out. It was lovely and cool. I used to watch the little train come puffing around, because the steam train used to cover that whole branch line. We used to cover.
Oh, the steam train.
Yeah, steam.
So who would have operated that train?
The WAGR. West Australian Government Railways, that was their own line, and that line used to come across Stirling Highway. So at a certain time, the men with the flags used to stand up, and all the cars would stop, and this little train would go puffing across the road, and all the work its way all the way around there. And it towed trucks of all sorts of things, stuff, produce going in, stuff coming back. In fact, nothing came on trucks in those days because there were no trucks, no real trucks. And there was a big party, and everybody attended this big party, and there was food there. And the thing was, all first-year apprentices had to independently get up on the stage and sing a song to the works that everybody was cheering. And of course, I was terrified that I had to do that, and I tell them in my story how we all went down to the Rose Hotel, us young apprentices, to have a few beers, to get out. Took quite ourselves down and give us a little bit of courage to go and do it. So we had a few beers and got all silly, and walked back to the works, and I got through it all right, but it was pretty frightening.
That sounds terrifying.
Yeah, well, you have to go through these things, don't you? Some sort of initiation, and that was it. But Yeah, that was the thing. It was quite a good thing. The kids had to sing, and there was a bloke with a Hammond organ there, and everybody sang along, and booed and all that. And once that was out of the way, good. You've had your initiation, then the old blokes would come and say, "Hey, you did a pretty good job there." Yeah, interesting people too. There were so many different people around from a lot of Europeans. After the Second World War, they migrated to Australia, and a lot of good technical people, craftsmen, tradesmen.
Every new apprentice was put with a tradesman for about a month before he got to work a machine. And in that time, there were the regular things like there was a big tool store, so the tradesman would write a note and you'd take it to the tool store and get a special spanner for that job or whatever. And some of them were things like a long wait, and you'd give it over and then you'd stand there and they'd be shuffling paper around or camouflage paint. Well, I think he must have been promised a job. I don't know for certain, but he went over to Cumming Smith's. They called it Cumming Smith's Mount Lyell then. Or late 1919, early 20s, yeah. Oh gosh, he worked there. He must have been there for over 40 years, I suppose. He had an accident there. What they did during the war, they built these concrete bunker type things up in case there was an acid spill, and it would flow into there instead of going down to the river. And he was there with a 14-pound sledgehammer demolishing these. And he swung and missed, and he threw the weight of his body against it. And he never reported the accident. He ended up retiring on an invalid pension. If he'd have reported it, he would have got compensation, but he didn't report it. Or very bad hip injury, he was more or less lame. Mum said, you could lay your hand in the indentation in his hip. Must have been. He always had a limp, and although he tried several things to relieve it, didn't much. So I think only as far as he did, it was a place of getting a living sort of thing. I don't think he really keen on working there. Yeah. But of course they used to have a separate plant where the sulphur, you could see the yellow coming out of it. And during the war, when they couldn't import the sulphur, they used porites, which they mined up in the goldfields for road base. Dad went up, he was the representative there, and he had to go, and they were giving a commission. He also, while he was the representative there, he says, if you've got any complaints, I'll take them to the boss as long as you come with me.
Well, you don't have to leave your curtains up for 20 years before, if you put your lace curtains up, you didn't take them down and wash them because they fell to bits. That was because of the soup works. It just rotted. But they just clung together, so you didn't take them down. If you took them down and washed them, because I had to polish the floorboards at home, and there was nothing between our house and the superworks. There was no housing, no nothing, and you couldn't see it, but I'd polish every Saturday down the sides of the hall runner, all nice jarrah polished. By the afternoon, I have to admit, we didn't get many colds or flus, because apparently it's good, down your throat. Although I have done a survey, my own personal, when I got leukemia, and I think I got up to 80 people from the river, where CSR, back to, I think I went back as far as Victoria Street. 80 people had died of cancer in that small area. And then I think they put plastic down, and then they put cement down. But people in Mosman Park know never ever to eat fish or shellfish out of there. And I know, well, all my friends say they wouldn't build there if they were given a block. No. CSR's fine, but as far as up there, no. They used to bring all the tailings down from the goldfields, and that had arsenic in it. And the pyrites, you've seen pyrites? It's like a red, you have apple crumble, well, it's like a red crumble. Mm-hmm. And the dump in Jamison Street, they dumped pyrites from there on there, and they had a big pyrites pond over near where the football oval is now. Danger, do not enter. Well, that was like red rag to a bull to us. We climbed the fence and went in, and we had it caked up to our knees. It dried like hard, and then we go home, and we had it as a front path for years because we didn't know. No one knew. It wasn't until they started digging there they said the pyrites was carcinogenic. I went, what? Because all the kids used to play in it.
Yes, that was always a place to keep away from because it stunk. Sorry, Mum. It was, yes, the acrid fumes coming from that was always a worry. Also, the discharge into the river was always a problem. You had to, when we had our canoes made out of corrugated iron, flattened on the back path, and we would always avoid the run out from both the engineering works and the sulphur works just dumped into the river. Big pipes coming in. Would always go well clear of that. Big murky stain would be in the river. But the smell of the sulphur works was something to avoid. When the coastal scramble was on every year, we would always go up there through the sulphur works and up to the coastal scramble on the Sunday, and then come back for lunch and then back again in the afternoon. You had to go past the sewerage dump, which was always unpleasant. We used crab round there. We would walk around the top of the cliffs. It was inaccessible along the river shore. You had to walk around there on the top of the cliffs. There was always a track there, and then we crabbed down on the flat, the open water there at the sugar refinery. Just fabulous. We'd cook them on the beach there at the river with my father and the two sisters and Mum. It was carefree, wonderful existence.
I mean, we used to, from where our house was, we could look out the side of our house and we could see the chimney from CSBP, and you'd see that sulphur-looking stuff coming out of the stack there. And but yeah, I talked to a bloke that used to work there. He ended up working at the sugar refinery after that closed, and he said there's a lot of stuff that just used to get poured into the ground, so that probably would have leached down into the river. So because there's a lot of caves under there, so I think they used to just so. But it took them a while to fix up the site down there and put it into that big area and cover it up. And
it was becoming old-fashioned and their technology was becoming outdated and old-fashioned. There wasn't a demand for a lot of things that they could make, and they could be made better in emerging modern structural shops, structural steel and things like that. they could do a much better job, and they were in modern places well away from town. And I think they offered a much better price, and eventually they felt that the government shouldn't be in it. This is when the Midland Railway workshops also closed down. It wasn't the government's job to be in this sort of business; it should be in private hands, and they gradually closed down. And they sold parts of them off. You know, the SEW was, I think they tried to sell it, but eventually, of course, it couldn't be sold because all those businesses had to go where they were because it was becoming residential. And we didn't want things like that there. And times had changed, and they had to go, and they did. But I think it's a pity that there's not more of a legacy, or there was not more preserved. There was no photographs taken. That's the thing that stuns me too. You go around, you think the various museums and things that work, you know, the industrial past, but there's no photographs. Even online, you go on the web, there's nothing there. There's a lot of nonsense about, but there's no photographs or actually people in it. It gradually disappeared, bits and pieces of it disappeared. I remember there was a great outrage when I was there. We have a blacksmith shop where they made huge blacksmith things with great big steam hammers used to make white hot metal into various shapes. And anyhow, we found that they were selling the steam hammer to a private operator, you know. There was another firm doing blacksmithing and they required a steam hammer, and it was, the one in the SEW was actually sold to them and removed. Well, the people were furious, you imagine. It was no longer operating. The shop was still there, but they took the hammer out of it and sold it to somebody else. That was when the place was starting to wind down. And all the guys were furious at how could, you know, selling our hammer to a private operator is going to make money. But that's, of course, that's what happened. Until eventually they didn't need them anymore. They made things otherwise. You know, that sort of technology. And, well, it's still used, but not to the extent it used to be. Everything was sort of forged and made in steel and stuff. Nowadays in plastic.
I was actually there when it happened because they rezoned it before I left. They had a big sign saying the council has rezoned this into R2, whatever it was for housing. They rezoned it a lot earlier. Big sign was out the front. CSR must have asked for it to be rezoned because it was industrial. And I went up to Brian Moyle. I said, so when are we all leaving? He goes, what? I said, well, it's rezoned. I said, that only means one thing. I said, housing. No. I said, I didn't fall off the Christmas tree. And walked out. And I think it was about 7 or 8 years later. And they sold it for a song. I don't know why they didn't build on it themselves, because they had building materials, they had insulation, they had cement. But they sold it to Sarich. And they had all the trees marked by the conservation people. They had yellow ribbons around the ones that were not to be pushed down. He came in and knocked the lot down. $1,000 a tree. To him it didn't matter. All the trees, the great big trees that I think had been there forever, big peppermint trees, all gone, and now they've planted oranges, lemons, olives. I don't know how many birds nest in orange lemons, but they certainly nested in the big gum trees. And I noticed it because there was an influx of kookaburras and magpies and woolly bagtails because the environment had gone, and they'd moved over to where I was living, homeless.
I reckon they sold it for a song anyway. That was ridiculous. But also a lot of the machinery in the factory was getting very old. It was battling to keep up with production because production was increasing so much, and it was going to be costing big dough to replace it. They did replace a lot of the smaller sort of areas, but when you get things like the boilers, because they were 1911 and 1912, those boilers, and it would be millions of dollars to put new boilers in, and so I think the economics of it didn't pass muster, I suppose you can say. No, when I first went there, it was very pathetic, the amount that they put in them and the amount of stuff. But in the last, say the last 10 years, they started another super scheme, and that's was just starting to get good on the finish. So it really didn't get enough time to build up enough.
But it's just very much an assembly plant anyway. But it's just a worldwide problem. Is that the labour costs just got too great. But there were other things opening up, like the mining industry and the supplies of, the support industries for the mining just took over completely. But we became very much a world, first world destination, or a first world employer, and so the rest of it went. And then I presume that's going to go on for a while. But everybody's going to have to wake up sooner or later. No, things will. I'm not a rabid socialist, but I am very much, not worried either. But people are going to have to change their tunes, because there's going to be a lot of reorganisation of manpower.
I think it's just economies of scale. It was quicker to bring as transport between WA and the East Coast got better. It was quicker to put the finished vehicles on trains and that and bring them over. And I think it was just the economies of scale. And I mean, for a long while after they stopped assembling them, they used to bring them in complete and just store them there, and bring them up to scratch. I've got a feeling they used to ship them in too.
Don't know. When I go through an industrial area now, I can see that nobody's making anything. They're assembling it or selling something. There's hardly anyone making anything. There used to be lots of people making things. And very few retailers, but now, because you go out to Bibra Lake and the industrial area there, there's thousands of buildings, and it's just reselling something else.
It was always, to my mind, the most magnificent area on a river, and to be used for industry was not the best use, I think, of prime land. So it was always, I didn't think that it would end up the way it is now, marvellous, and that wonderful walking track and cycle track there is along the cliffs there. I never thought of those things back in those days, but certainly it was, to me, an area that was underutilised, and when industry went, it would have to be housing. But industry, of course, was very close to the city and Fremantle in years gone by. So as we got bigger, well, the industry has gone further away. But the people who've got the housing there now are called, Minimum Cove? Oh, they'll be very, very glad it closed. All of that closed along there. It's a magnificent area.
We're not good on industrial heritage. Not good at all. No, we don't see that. That's why I think when the state engineer, when they cleared all that away and built all those blessed awful houses there where there's not a soul around, they're completely silent, there's nobody there at all. all these awful houses, and I think, well, we don't seem to have any idea of our heritage. There is heritage there in engineering. We rave on about the country and the shearers and all that sort of stuff, but we've forgotten about this side of things too. Yeah, all the old timers have all gone. Yeah, it's changed completely. It's becoming quite a high class, lovely homes, nice area to live in. You know, well, that's all beautiful. Yeah. It was very working class, you know, in those days, as you imagine. I went down there to see if there's any trace of what was there, you know, because I'd lived in Sydney most of my life, so I'd come back to find all this area's total housing, you know, and I went back there and I was stunned that there was not even a plaque or anything in that little park at the end to say, here stood the State Engineering Works that did so much for Australia during the Second World War, and the country too, you know, not a mention of it.
Yes, and you know, on a personal note, I'm heartbroken to see they've gone, those factories, because it's like having, for me at my age, and I'm 73, I'm coming up to 73, it's like having a part of my life just wiped off the landscape. In other words, you don't realise how important it is to you to go somewhere and say, oh, I used to work at that place, or something like that, and you've probably had that. And an older woman who used to work at the original Bones in Perth and places like that. For me, to go through Mosman Park now, and there's no Sugar Works, and there's no General Motors, it's almost as though I've had a whole section of my life just deleted and wiped away with a big eraser of some sort. And you don't appreciate it at the time, it's when you go and think about it and you think, wow, I'm quite hurt about that, which is ridiculous, because you can't stop progress. But it's just your personal connection with a part of your life that's so far back has been gone. And perhaps subliminally, we do always long for the actual physical edifice to still be there as part of our memories and recollections. And when they've gone, there's nothing else other than the verbatim translation. And that's quite sad, quite sad.